Now that we've covered the main concepts behind Bitcoin, how to use it, and some implementation details, I want to discuss some of the more interesting advanced features. Many of these are already available, others are coming soon. I also want to cover some of the challenges Bitcoin faces so that viewers walk away with a balanced view of where Bitcoin is and where it's going. The mantra, be your own bank, the idea that you and you alone control the keys to your money, is one of the main selling points of Bitcoin. However, when you control your own keys, you also bear the full responsibility for not losing those keys. Remember, if you lose the private keys to your Bitcoin wallet, either to a hacker or to a bad hard drive, your funds will be irrevocably lost. There's no bank or police department that can be called for help. This risk means that backups are essential for Bitcoin wallets, but many early wallets made this cumbersome. The first Bitcoin wallet software was called JBock Wallet, or just a bunch of keys. For each Bitcoin address in the wallet, a corresponding private key was stored. As the recommended privacy practice is to create a new address for each incoming transaction, a new private key would also be created. This meant you needed to create a backup of your wallet every time a new address was created. Now, most wallets only require one backup when you first set them up. They're called deterministic wallets, as every key is determined from a single seed. Here's how this works. Each key is derived from a seed and an integer through a hash function. In this way, a nearly infinite number of new keys can all be made from a single seed. The corresponding public key and Bitcoin address can then be derived from each private key as shown before. Many wallets use this idea internally and are also guiding users to make backups before beginning to receive any coins. Mycelium, for instance, strongly encourages you to write down 12 words that represent that seed. These words are known as a mnemonic code, a human-friendly way to represent a number. Each word is pulled from a list of 2048 words, each of which represents an 11-bit number. Strung together and put into a hash, they become a number that can be the seed for a deterministic wallet. So who makes this list of words? You can find the list used by many wallets at the Bitcoin GitHub page under the BIPs section and BIP39. BIPs stand for Bitcoin Improvement Proposals, and this is the main method new features are proposed and evaluated. On the main BIP page, you can see a list of ideas, their authors, and status. Each BIP contains a concise description of the feature, motivation, and a brief technical specification. Another relatively new resource for keeping up with the latest features is bitcoincore.org. With that brief aside about where to learn about the latest Bitcoin features, let's get back to wallets and the challenge of being your own bank. The ability to generate all your keys from a single seed greatly reduces the original difficulty in maintaining an up-to-date backup. But there are still cases where having a single account is problematic, especially in organizations. Consider an organization with many branches and divisions where each subgroup needs to manage its own account without having access to the other group's accounts. The CEO should have visibility and control over all these groups, ideally without having to manage a large set of separate private keys, which would be a burden to back up and maintain. This is where the additional tweak to our deterministic wallet can be given hierarchical structure. Suppose we add a new chain code field to our key generator shown before, where that chain code is also a random number. Now, if I'm the CEO, I can give each group a different chain code, thereby letting them all derive as many keys as needed, but also allowing me to generate those keys. The full specification, known as BIP32, provides for a systematic way to create hierarchies that is deterministic, meaning you can start from the seed and be sure you're going to get the same keys out every time. One additional surprising and useful feature of hierarchical deterministic wallets, or HD wallets, is that it's not only possible to derive chains of private keys, but also public keys without any knowledge of a private key. This means an exposed e-commerce web server could derive a new public key for every order without having access to the corresponding private keys. Without this ability, you would have to pre-generate a list of public keys to give to the web server if you didn't want to place any of the private keys on that server. The ability to derive public keys without a private key takes advantage of some subtle math inside the elliptic curve public key cryptography we've been using. Permit me to shine a little more light into this black box. It turns out that deriving a public key from a private key is like multiplication, although multiplication over an elliptic curve, not simple arithmetic multiplication. The formula for a public key is to multiply a point on an elliptic curve by a private key, which is a large random number. While not simple arithmetic, it does share some of the same rules we expect, namely the distributive property. This means I can sum before or after multiplying by g, and the answer is the same. If I define a private key k'pri3 is equal to k'pri1 plus k'pri2, this means I can get to a public key kpub3 in two ways. The normal way of just multiplying the private key by g, or by distributing g, I can see that I get there by simply adding two other public keys. The take-home here is that kpriv3, the private key for this public key, is not in that formula. Here's how we can take advantage of this to generate public keys without their corresponding private keys. Consider this formula. Public key n is equal to kpubmaster plus hash of a seed and integer times g. An exposed server could use that formula to generate a nearly unlimited number of new public keys by inputting new values for n, all while never having access to any of the private key n's. To generate the private keys on another secure server, I use knowledge of the master private key. If I substitute kprimaster times g for kpubmaster and pull out the g, we see that the nth private key is just the sum of the master key and our hash. The important part of this is that kprimaster is never on the exposed server. Even if a hacker discovered all the other information on the exposed server, including the kpubmaster and the seed, he could not spend any funds sent to those addresses. Many wallets have already implemented the backup feature of just having to write down 12 words to recover a wallet, no matter how many addresses you generate. But I haven't seen many implementations that support the hierarchy part of HD wallets. I can provide a quick demo using Bitcore, though. In my corporation, I have two departments, A and B. I first start off creating a top-level HD private key. This function just generates a random key if you don't supply any arguments, so remember to back this up before sending any money to it. Then I'll make a private key for Department A and one for B. Now Department A can derive further children from that without giving any visibility or access to B. In Department B, there's an exposed web server that I want to generate receiving addresses, but I don't want to have any private keys on that server. I make a new private key for that server and also a public key. I put the public key on that server and from that derive new addresses for each order. On a secure server, I can generate the corresponding private keys. Note that there are some important security subtleties that I've skipped here, namely about hardened keys, so be sure to read more before implementing such a system. Overall, we see that HD wallets help manage some of the challenges posed by being your own bank and having to carefully manage the keys to that bank. The deterministic nature makes backups much more manageable, enabling you to create an initial backup just once, rather than having to back up a new private key for every address. The hierarchical part helps organizations structure access. And finally, these techniques can even separate key generation from private keys for exposed servers. Even with the benefits of HD wallets, you still have one set of keys for any given account. And this presents some security risk for any organization that doesn't want to trust just one person to run off with money. This is where the multi-signature scheme I mentioned in previous modules comes to the rescue. Recall that Bitcoin addresses are more than just receiving accounts, but are scripts or puzzles that must be unlocked to access funds. It's this feature that enables you to set up an address that requires, say, 3 of 5 signatures to unlock. BitPay's CoPay wallet has a nice interface for this, which I'll briefly demonstrate. I add a new wallet and choose the Shared Wallet tab. I'll call it Acme Inc. type in my name, and then choose a 2 out of 3 requirement to spend funds. I'll also set this to the testnet so I'm not playing with real money. Now, 2 other officers in my company can join this by choosing Join a Shared Wallet on another device. To spend money, one person initiates the transaction and creates one of the signatures. Others then receive a notification and can simply accept to finish sending the funds. You could also use a 1 of 2 account to provide a joint checking account style access. The 2 of 3 scheme is also used by a new wallet product called Case. This is a hardware wallet that has a worldwide cellular connection, camera to scan a QR code Bitcoin address, and fingerprint scanner. To send money, you scan a QR code and swipe the fingerprint scanner. It then connects to a Case server to provide the second signature and broadcast the transaction. If you lose your device, your funds can be recovered by using Case's key and a third key stored at a separate company. With this product, the 2 of 3 scheme provides 2-factor authorization and backup. A service called Green Address also utilizes 2 of 2 signatures. Each transaction requires a signature from their service as well as your device. This bolsters security because 2 factors are needed, and it also enables you to set withdrawal limits. They provide time-locked backup transactions to recover your funds in case their service disappears, a feature we'll discuss soon. These 2 services offer interesting alternatives to the responsibility of holding and safeguarding private keys solely on your own. There's a growing ecosystem of choices that allow you to choose how much control and responsibility you have. With Coinbase, they hold the private keys, but also all the responsibility. If you ever lose your password, they can always help you recover access. On the other end, wallets like Electrum and Mycelium give you complete control, but also complete responsibility. Green Address and Case offer a bit of middle ground, sharing some control and responsibility with you for backing up and safeguarding those private keys. Being your own bank, in addition to meaning that you alone control your funds, also means that there's no intermediary between 2 people when sending money. This is good because it reduces cost and prevents censorship, but in some cases we rely on intermediaries like credit cards to prevent fraud. If you buy something online and the merchant never ships it, a credit card company can usually recover your money. To provide this ability in Bitcoin, you need to use an escrow service. Using the 2 of 3 multi-signature scheme, this can be done with surprisingly little trust. Suppose Bob wants to buy a painting from Charlie, but doesn't trust Charlie will deliver the painting after receiving funds. Bob and Charlie agree to use a third party, Alice, as an arbitrator in case there are any disagreements. Charlie creates a 2 of 3 transaction by first collecting the public keys of Alice and Bob, and then crafts a pay-to-script hash multi-signature type transaction. Recall that this means the payment is sent to a hash of a script. To spend funds, you need to provide a script that hashes to this value along with any necessary signatures. Charlie sends this script to Bob, who checks to make sure the public keys are right, hashes it, and then makes payment to that hash address. Once Charlie sees payment, he ships the painting. If there are no problems, Charlie can construct a transaction that pays him the full amount of the order. The input to that transaction will be the 2 of 3 script and 2 signatures. Charlie adds his signature and sends it to Bob to add his signature and unlock the funds. Notice that Alice, the arbitrator, wasn't involved at all in this case. Since this didn't require any work on her part, she might not charge anything if arbitration isn't needed. Suppose, however, the painting wasn't exactly what Bob hoped it would be, so Bob asks for a refund. Charlie disagrees and enlists the help of Alice to arbitrate. Alice requests evidence from both sides and decides that neither party is completely right, so she creates a new transaction splitting the money, 49% to both Bob and Charlie, and 2% to her as a fee. She provides her signature and passes the transaction on to Bob and Charlie, either of whom can sign it to send it. Interestingly, if Bob and Charlie aren't happy with the resolution, they can create a new 2 of 3 transaction, sending the funds to a new arbitrator. At no point does any one party have full control over the funds. A real-life version of this service can be found at bitrated.com, which facilitates escrow transactions and has an eBay-like rating system. The main innovation of Bitcoin is often said to be decentralization. However, there are several areas where Bitcoin is unfortunately more centralized than many would hope. As mentioned previously, in order to be competitive in the mining or voting process, specialized equipment and cheap power is needed. This has led to a migration from individuals running Bitcoin servers on personal computers to dedicated companies running massive farms of specialized computers that do nothing else but calculate the proof-of-work function. Also, the pooling of miners has further centralized voting or mining power. Recall that winning a block is like winning the lottery, so most miners work in pools to increase the frequency of payouts. In a typical mining pool, the pool operator chooses the transactions to be included in a block, the block to build on, and the version of software to run. The pool participants only receive the block header and work to find block solutions based on that alone, thereby giving the pool operator a substantial amount of power. Since only a handful of pools control the majority of all hashing power on the Bitcoin network, the current mining power is surprisingly concentrated. Now, this does not mean the miners have total control. If the miners should change rules against the ultimate desire of end users, who are the ones that trade real goods and services for Bitcoin, those users would switch to a different chain, making the new miner coins worthless. In this author's opinion, however, it's unclear where the balance of power lies, especially in the short term. Recently, there have also been some technical pressures towards centralization. Since very early in Bitcoin's development, there has been a 1 megabyte cap on the size of blocks. As of March 1, 2016, the average block size was 0.85 megabytes, and some transactions are starting to be delayed since there's not enough room in each block. There's only capacity for about 4 transactions per second. Some are not concerned because even with full blocks, you should be able to get a transaction through by paying a higher fee. However, others think this is bad because it would make Bitcoin cost prohibitive for small amounts. While increasing the block size may seem like an obvious solution, many are opposed to this because they fear it will increase centralization. As the block size grows, the network, storage, and computing resources needed to operate a full node increase, making it harder for individuals to run full nodes. This results in further concentration of control in larger institutional operators. Interestingly, the block size debate appears to be highlighting another source of centralization: code development. There are currently only a handful of core developers that maintain the main GitHub repository and websites like bitcoin.org. While the code is completely open, the vast majority of miners run code released by this Bitcoin core team. This is because running any other code has a high risk of being separated from the main network. If you are a voter or miner and run software that disagrees about what a valid block is with the rest of the network, even if the disagreement is caused by a bug in the core code, your blocks may be ignored by the rest of the network. Surprisingly, the only real specification for Bitcoin is the live C++ code that the majority of miners are running. Despite this risk, miners are beginning to run different software, as the block size debate has spurred developers to publish different solutions. One release simply increases the block size to 8 megabytes. Another has an averaging system, another lets miners vote, and yet another lets miners accept large blocks but only produce smaller ones. There's currently no consensus or indication of which will win out. The debate has also spurred discussion beyond just what the block size should be, to fundamental questions about governance. How should future decisions be made, and who should make them? Although Bitcoin is idealized as a math-based, trustless currency, many are realizing that it is ultimately a social agreement between people. Some technical decisions will help one group at the expense of another with no clear superior technical metric. In other words, the decisions are political. If and when changes are introduced, they will be implemented in what are called hard or soft forks. A soft fork is a rule change that old software will still accept, whereas a hard fork creates new blocks that the old software rejects. There's potential disruption on either path, but most developers feel a soft fork is much less risky. Let's see how both of these work. With either change, developers usually build in a voting mechanism that enables miners to make sure a majority are upgraded before activating a change. This is usually done with a version setting in each block. For instance, the change won't activate until 750 of the last 1,000 blocks indicated an upgrade in the version setting. 1,000 blocks is about a week. We'll walk through the hard fork case first. Suppose the block size is increased to 2 megabytes. Older nodes would see blocks over 1 megabyte as invalid and ignore them. So even though a majority of nodes are running new software, the minority would continue on its own branch, splitting the network. Furthermore, all the non-mining nodes that don't upgrade will also be on the older branch, potentially including wallets and web services. Now let's walk through a soft fork. Just for illustration purposes, suppose the new software decreased the block size to 0.5 megabytes. This imposes an additional constraint on the rules that old software does not know about but considers valid. As new blocks are generated, the old software is unaware but happily builds on either. The new software only builds on smaller blocks. However, since we assume a majority of miners are running the new software, no more old blocks will ever make it into the chain. Even if the old software wins a few blocks in a row, the new branch will eventually win out because it has the majority of hashing power. The advantage of a soft fork is that older software will at least accept the new blocks. But there's still some potential disruption. Miners running older software will be wasting energy creating blocks that will never be accepted. And non-mining nodes will also not be aware of the new rules. Consider the case of the pay-to-script hash feature, which was added as a soft fork. This added a new constraint to the output scripts that look like this. In English, this reads, "In order to spend this coin, supply text that hashes to this given value." The new software added an additional constraint that the text also needs to be a valid script and not just random text. Someone running old software could receive a transaction spinning an invalid script and ship a good only to find out later that the rest of the network rejected that transaction. Bear in mind, this is only possible if the receiver accepts 0 confirmation transactions, though. Since the majority of miners switched to the new software, no older blocks that would accept such an invalid transaction will ever make it in again. So whether hard or soft fork, eventually all software needs to update. Getting back to the block size debate, increasing the block size to 2 megabytes would be a simple code change, but since that would be a hard fork, most developers are nervous about introducing it. It turns out, however, that another unrelated feature will increase the block size as a side effect and can be implemented as a soft fork. This interesting new feature is called segregated witness. The term witness here is just a different word for the word signatures that we've been using to describe the scripts that unlock funds. In mathematics, a witness is an example that proves a statement. For instance, if I say, there exists a number bigger than 1,000, the number 1001 is a witness that proves that statement. Recall in Bitcoin transactions, the signature in most cases is more than a simple signature from public key cryptography, but rather a script that fulfills a spend condition specified in a transaction output. So segregated witness is referring to the thing we've been calling a signature, but the word witness is used to cover the broader concept and avoid confusion with public key signatures. The segregating part of this new change refers to pulling the signatures out of transactions. This was originally introduced to solve a problem where transactions could be superficially changed, called transaction malleability. One of the ways this occurs is due to a subtlety in the elliptic curve cryptography. Imagine if a number 5 is a valid signature, then something like 5 and -5 are both valid. Suppose you create a transaction and sign it with 5, but someone else changes the signature to -5 before passing it along. This is only an issue before a transaction gets confirmed into the blockchain. While it's not necessarily a security vulnerability, as a hacker can't change the contents of a transaction, including the recipients or amounts, it does end up changing the hash and therefore the ID of the transaction. If you made a transaction that someone malleates, you wouldn't be able to find the transaction in the blockchain based on your original hash ID. You could still look it up based on your addresses. The changed ID could also break some protocols I'll talk about a little later that rely on links between unconfirmed transactions. To address this, the segregated witness feature separates the signatures or witnesses from the transaction. In this way, the hash of the transaction will not change even if the signature does. It also introduces some other benefits. For one, after a transaction has been verified, you can forget about the signatures since you don't need them to calculate who owns what coins. This means storage for the blockchain could be drastically reduced since signatures take up about 2/3 of every block. It also means syncing the blockchain could be much faster if you don't care about validating signatures. There are some other potential benefits as well, making it easier for SPV clients to verify blocks, and potentially making it easier to extend the scripting language itself. Getting back to the block size, by pulling signatures out of the transactions, the segregated witness feature basically changes the rules for how a block size is calculated, subtly allowing more transactions to fit in with a soft fork change. With the current segregated witness proposal, the block size gets effectively doubled. Now, older nodes will have to upgrade to properly interpret these blocks, but the network won't split. Also note that nodes that want to fully validate the blockchain will still have to store and transfer the same amount of data per transaction, so this feature does not address concerns about centralization due to small operators not being able to handle more data. If the block size does not get increased, it's highly likely that fees will increase, making smaller transactions cost prohibitive. Already, as of March 2016, the average cost of sending a transaction is approaching 10 cents. Because of this, many are looking at ways to send small, low-risk transactions off the main Bitcoin chain. One of the most popular services for sending small amounts of Bitcoin is ChangeTip. Once you create an account and fund it with Bitcoin, you can tip extremely small amounts on social services like YouTube and Reddit. On Reddit, you can tip a poster by writing, "User ChangeTip, send 50 cents." The ChangeTip service will automatically respond with a link that lets the poster collect that tip. ChangeTip can provide almost free service since it's simply changing two numbers, the balance for the sender and receiver, on its own server. It will charge a small fee to withdraw Bitcoin. The downside is that ChangeTip is a centralized service like PayPal. There are also some exciting innovations coming that allow small payments to be sent both without high fees and without trusting a third party. One of these is called payment channels. Suppose Alice runs a Wi-Fi hotspot where people can access the internet for 1 cent per megabyte. Bob wants to use Alice's Wi-Fi, but purchasing each megabyte with a standard Bitcoin payment would cost more in fees than the service itself, and would also require 10-minute wait times for each purchase if Alice didn't accept zero confirmation transactions. One way Alice could provide this service with lower fees is to ask Bob to deposit, say, $50 when he first connects. Then when he's done using the service, Alice calculates his total usage and sends him a refund for any amount not used. Alternatively, Alice could allow Bob to just use the service and charge him later, like a typical tab at a bar. The problem with these methods is that they require trust. Either Bob hopes Alice doesn't steal his deposit, or Alice hopes Bob doesn't run off without paying. The payment channels protocol enables a similar arrangement, but without the trust requirement. I'm going to switch to using millibits, or 1/1000th of a Bitcoin. Bob first creates a 2 of 2 multi-signature transaction for 50 millibits. This transaction does not pay Bob or Alice individually, but rather locks the funds in an output condition that requires both Bob and Alice's signature to spend. This is the payment channel funding transaction. To purchase his first megabyte, Bob creates a new transaction sourcing that funding output, and giving 49.99 millibits back to himself and 0.01 to Alice. He signs the transaction and sends it to Alice. At this point, Alice could sign and broadcast the transaction to receive 0.01 millibits, but she doesn't because Bob plans to keep using the service. When he wants to buy a second megabyte, he creates another transaction sourcing the same funding transaction, this time sending 0.02 millibits to Alice and 49.98 back to himself. This transaction replaces the first because it is spending the same output. This pattern continues until Bob tells Alice he's done, and then she broadcasts the final transaction, say for 40 millibits back to Bob and 10 to her. At no point was Alice at risk of Bob not paying, as she could have broadcast the last transaction received. And Bob was able to pay for Wi-Fi service 1 megabyte at a time without risking that Alice would run off with any deposit. The payment channel protocol effectively allowed them to exchange 1,000 transactions while only broadcasting and paying the fees for 2 transactions. The middle transactions are real Bitcoin transactions, they're just not posted, allowing payment channels to leverage Bitcoin security without touching the network. There are a few caveats I should point out. Consider that the overall funding transaction was sent to an output that required both Alice and Bob's signatures. If Alice never responded, Bob's funds would be locked away forever. To handle this case, Bob could require Alice to give him a full refund transaction locked for 24 hours before Bob posted his initial payment. This way, after 24 hours, Bob would get his money back if Alice disappeared. The 24-hour lock is provided by a parameter on transactions called nlock time. If the nlock time parameter is set, the transaction isn't considered valid until that time. This solution has some vulnerability due to the transaction malleability issue we discussed previously. A malicious server could modify the original funding transaction before it posts to the blockchain, making the reference to that transaction in the refund transaction invalid. Luckily, a new feature just activated provides a more secure solution to this protocol and several others. It's called Check Lock Time Verify and provides a secure way to lock up funds until a given time in the future. Here's how this would work in our example with Bob and Alice. Bob adds an additional line of logic to his original funding transaction output script that says the funds are spendable by just his signature after 24 hours. The full logic looks like this. This is the script language inside Bitcoin's transactions. Translated into English, this says the output is spendable with Alice's and Bob's signatures, or if Alice's signature is not valid, the output is spendable if the current time is greater than the time specified. The difference between this technique and the previous nlock time technique is that here the time delay is embedded in a script confirmed in the blockchain, whereas nlock time transactions cannot be confirmed until their time threshold is passed. One constraint is on the blockchain, the other is not. Here's how the version that is not on the blockchain could break our payment channel refund. Bob insists that Alice signed the refund transaction before he posts the funding transaction. Remember, the whole point of the refund transaction is to have a backup in case Alice disappears. And here's the problem. Alice could sign the refund, but if Bob's funding transaction gets changed through transaction malleability before it gets confirmed, the refund now doesn't point to the right output and is worthless. By supporting time locks inside scripts, many other interesting smart contracts are possible. For instance, suppose Charles and David operate an account requiring both of their signatures to spend. With the new locking script, they can include a safety mechanism that allows spending by just one of the two after some delay in case one of them disappears. The payment channel idea of guaranteeing payments without actually posting transactions and paying fees can be extended to a much larger net of people in a new protocol called Lightning Network. This includes sending transactions through networks of payment channels. The idea, if successfully implemented, will provide a substantial increase in capacity to the Bitcoin network. Only transactions to set up and close payment channels would need to touch the Bitcoin network, while the majority could be completed off-chain. People would use the Bitcoin network and protocol as a guarantee of payment without actually needing to transact on it in most cases. Not only would people save on fees, but transactions could be finalized in milliseconds instead of minutes. One drawback to the Lightning Network idea is the need to lock away funds while a payment channel is open. This means there will still likely be fees for using the network to compensate people for having funds locked up. Also, there are several other changes needed to the core Bitcoin code, namely the use of script blocks based on relative time and not absolute time. I mentioned already that full blocks will likely cause fees to increase, as there will be more competition to get transactions into limited space, and miners will choose the transactions with the highest fees first. Beyond the obvious downside of having to pay more to send Bitcoins, another issue is that transactions with too low a fee may get stuck. For instance, if you send a transaction with a 0.001 millibit fee when there's an endless supply of transactions offering a higher fee, miners may never include your transaction. Why not simply broadcast another transaction with a higher fee? Most nodes are programmed currently to ignore such double spend attempts. However, a new patch just released changes this so that nodes will accept the higher fee version. This allows you to broadcast a low priority transaction with a low fee, wait and see if it gets confirmed, and only if necessary, broadcast a higher fee version later. The downside of this patch is that zero confirmation transactions become riskier. The change makes it easier to undo transactions by changing the destination of a transaction along with its fee. This means use cases like buying a cup of coffee where the seller typically doesn't wait for a confirmation are more exposed to fraud. There are two more topics I'd like to briefly mention before concluding this module. Another recent addition to Bitcoin, BIP70, known as Payment Protocol, provides much better security and convenience when exchanging payment details. As explained so far, to get paid, you provide a Bitcoin address and an amount to a payor. The payor then broadcasts a Bitcoin transaction for that amount to the Bitcoin network. This is a little scary. Are you sure you typed in the right address? Are you sure someone else didn't intercept the address and swap it for one of their own? Furthermore, if you did accidentally pay the wrong but honest person, it's not always possible to determine where to return the money. Transactions can have inputs signed by several different people. The payment protocol addresses many of these concerns, starting with a way to prove the Bitcoin addresses supplied were created by the company you think they were. This is made possible by creating a payment request that includes the Bitcoin address and then signing it using the same technology that protects encrypted websites. Allow me to take a brief aside to explain how information you send to websites is secured. When you go to Amazon.com, Amazon sends you its public key so you can encrypt your communication to Amazon, like your credit card number. To make sure you're using Amazon's public key and not a hacker's, Amazon also provides a certificate containing a signature from Google, allowing you to check that Google believes Amazon's public key is correct. You can then check Google's signature because your operating system shipped with its public key. This is a fairly large simplification, but this same chain of public keys that allows you to check websites can allow you to check that a payment request and all its contents was generated by the company you think it was. The protocol also includes a few more useful fields, including a descriptive memo, a refund address, and the option to include not just one receiving address, but several. Without a refund address, a merchant would have to reach back out to a customer to ask where to send funds. The option to include several pay addresses in a payment request brings up a final topic: privacy. Suppose you work at a company that pays salary in Bitcoin. Now, at dinner, if you sent $10 to a friend to cover your share of the tab, that transaction might source a salary payment output, and your friend could see how much money you make. With the payment protocol, you could request your employer pay to 100 addresses in much smaller amounts, thereby obscuring your salary. At this point, I'd like to offer a few reasons why privacy is important, especially for Bitcoin and financial matters. Many people argue that they don't have anything to hide, and so privacy doesn't matter. Even if you're not engaged in illegal activity, privacy can be important. In business negotiations, if one party knows the financial situation of the other, they could use that information to their advantage. For example, if a large company knows a small company does not have very much cash, The large company could initiate a costly court case to exhaust the limited funds of the smaller company. Or perhaps a landlord could raise your rent if he knows you recently got a raise. While no one may abuse your financial information today, information on the blockchain is long-lived. 10 years from now, a company might analyze and sell information about your long-past spending habits, possibly to a bank where you've applied for a loan. Also, there's no guarantee that a benevolent government today won't change in the future. Finally, if funds can be precisely tracked, certain Bitcoin addresses may at some point be blacklisted. By analogy, imagine if a thief stole your wallet that had a $100 bill in it. What if you had written down the serial number on that bill and reported it stolen? Theoretically, every person in the world could check any bill received against a blacklist of serial numbers and refuse any bills on that list. But this would impose enormous transaction cost. If such a blacklist were created for Bitcoin, it would impact the currency's fungibility or the equivalency of one Bitcoin to another. To prevent a loss of fungibility and increase privacy, there are several proposals that reduce the traceability of Bitcoin. One of these is called CoinJoin. In this protocol, several people submit similar amounts as inputs to a transaction and then get the money returned in outputs. In this way, it's not clear which input went to which output. The transaction effectively mixes the inputs. Interestingly, the transaction can be completed largely in a trustless way. First, a transaction is created with the requisite inputs and outputs. Then each participant signs their input and passes it along to the next for their signature. Since each signature covers all the outputs, there's no risk that the transaction can change throughout this process. If the CoinJoin process is repeated multiple times with different people, the probability that one address is associated with another becomes lower and lower. The downsides of this process include fees needed for each mixing transaction, as well as the practical difficulty in finding equal amounts to mix. If one person comes to the table with 100 Bitcoins and two others with 0.1 Bitcoins, it's very easy to see where the money went. While there are many in the Bitcoin community that see privacy and fungibility as crucial to a currency, that view is not universal and it's not clear where Bitcoin will end up. Bitcoin is much different than past paper money. It's completely digital, so checking every transaction against a blacklist is feasible. Consider that every transaction is already checked for double spends. There's also less ambiguity than with paper money. The ownership chain is sometimes provable. You may receive a coin one day that is provably linked to a ransom payment. It will be interesting to see where the technology and debate takes us. In this module, we've gone a bit deeper into Bitcoin to learn about some of its challenges and recent innovations to address those challenges. The mantra, "Be your own bank," means Bitcoin users have complete control of their funds, but also the ability to lose access to their funds without any helpline to call. HD or hierarchical deterministic wallets make backups much simpler and also provide needed structure for organizations. The scripting language in Bitcoin also aids in supplying additional structure through multi-signature addresses, such as addresses that can only be spent with 3 of 5 signatures. Multi-signature scripts, along with the addition of time locks, enable contracts for many other interesting use cases. One of these is payment channels, which enable a stream of instant and micro-sized transactions between two people at low cost. If expanded to larger groups through the Lightning Network idea, it presents a promising way to extend the capacity of the Bitcoin network without compromising on trust. Segregated witnesses, in addition to solving transaction malleability, will also increase capacity by reducing the amount of data needed by some users. Segregated witnesses will also provide a near-term block size increase. Bitcoin is only about 6 years old at this point, but already very successful. Its market cap, or price times the total Bitcoin in the world, is already over $6 billion, and there are now over 200,000 transactions per day. However, despite what many had hoped, it has not yet replaced credit cards. It's still very rare to find any brick-and-mortar stores that accept it. Bitcoin has also not replaced Western Union for remittances. The last mile, or exchanging Bitcoin for fiat currency, is still very difficult. There's a bit of a catch-22 with any currency. The more people use it, the more valuable it is, but people won't use something that isn't already valuable. Along with adoption, Bitcoin faces many other challenges, including its usability, capacity, privacy, and centralization. Centralization is perhaps the most concerning, as decentralization is arguably Bitcoin's main innovation. Right now, very few people control the majority of mining power. There are, however, several thousand non-mining nodes also running, and these counterbalance the power of the miners to some degree since most end users connect through these. But the cost of running a full node will increase as Bitcoin becomes more popular, and there are few incentives to run such a node. Another problem with increased usage is that Bitcoin becomes harder to update. There's more money at stake and more people that need to agree on any given change. There are, however, some changes being developed that will hopefully make improvements easier in the future. The core code is being modularized so that developers can work on specific areas without fearing that the critical consensus code is affected. Several nodes on the network are now running different versions, and hopefully there will eventually be a diverse ecosystem of software all communicating via the Bitcoin protocol, much like internet services over TCP/IP today. Since the dawn of Bitcoin, many developers have created whole new systems rather than try to get their ideas incorporated into Bitcoin itself. This is the world we'll explore in the last module, Beyond Bitcoin.